Now, another type of copper cable that we have is something called coaxial. And a coaxial cable is made up of 4 layers. And if you look at the top picture, it shows one of these wires stripped down to being able to see each of those 4 layers. The innermost layer is what we call the copper core. This is the actual copper wire that the electricity is traveling on. Okay, so this is where the data is actually going to travel. We then have an inner insulator that goes around that copper core, and what that's insulating it from is from this wire mesh shielding, which is, again, another layer of copper or foil sometimes. Okay, and this is to actually help insulate from EMI. And because these coaxial cables aren't going to be twisted around one another, very often we would have bundles of these coaxial cables all running side by side. You have to have that extra insulation. Okay, so that's what that wire mesh is for. And then outside of that, we have that outer insulator, and that's what you would typically see, meaning that's the outside of the cable itself. The only type of coaxial cable that's really still used these days is something called thin net coaxial cable. Specification on it is RG58. Data can travel at 10 megabits per second, which is why you can imagine that we don't see this very often anymore. It can travel up to 185 meters without suffering from attenuation. Okay, so we can get longer distances with these cables. The connector is something called a BNC connector, and I have that illustrated in the bottom picture. But as I mentioned, we don't really see this very much because this has all been primarily replaced with twisted pair cabling. I will also tell you, just one quick little side note here, there's another type of coaxial cable called thick net. And thick net coaxial cable used a different type of connector. The easiest way to describe it is it was thicker. Okay, that's why we called it thin net and thick net. I don't want to go into the details or the specs. It'll just make things more confusing. But I just want to mention there is something out there called thick net. Now, I mentioned RG58, and the reason I mention this is because there's also a couple other specifications of coaxial cable called RG59 and RG6. And these are the types of coaxial cable that you would see connected to your television. Okay, so if you have cable TV and you're thinking, well, I plug in with a coaxial cable. Could I just use that for my computer network? No, you cannot. The specifications don't match. And on top of that, you'll notice that the connector is not exactly the same. Okay, you don't use this BNC connector with your television. You typically have a connector that either just slides right on or screws on. Whereas the BNC connector is kind of you slide it on and then you do a little quarter turn clip to make it hold in place.